And that's how the story goes up to 1990. As far as Sayyid Qutb's disciples, Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden, who eventually pair up at the hip. But as far as the path taken with Qutb's disciple, Sheikh Abdel Rahman, that becomes a whole different story.
Sheikh Abdul Rahman is a rather intriguing individual. He became blind as a child because of juvenile diabetes, and yet had great charismatic power, not despite this, but in part because of this. He was tortured for an extensive period of time, about 3 years, to reveal his role in setting the emotional climate that led to the assassination of Sadat. He ultimately was not convicted of this, in part because of his blindness. How can one convict a man just because of words?
Abdel Rahman was born on May 3rd, 1938, in the city of Al-Gamaliya, Egypt. He lost his eyesight when he was 10 months old. He studied a Braille version of the Quran as a child and had it memorized by age 11 and was sent to an Islamic boarding school. Excelling there, and his academic achievements allowed him to enter Cairo's University's School of Theology and later at the prestigious University of Al-Azhar. Abdel Rahman earned degrees in Islamic jurisprudence. He developed an interest in the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Sayyid Qutb. Soon after leaving university, he became a religious scholar with a militant Islamist agenda. This extremist ideology prescribes identifying Muslims who violate strict Islamic principles as apostates that deserve death. And Abdel Rahman started preaching it against the secular regime of Egyptian President Gamal Nasser. In 1965, he preached at a small mosque about 60 miles south of Cairo, but his attacks against Nasser's regime led to his dismissal from his religious teaching post in 1969. This setback only intensified his hatred of Nasser and his regime. He then found work teaching at a girls' school south of Cairo in Assuit. Perturbed by his mounting attacks, Egyptian authorities arrested him in 1970, and he spent 8 months in Citadel prison. Rahman was released in 1971, but was barred from working again as a teacher until the summer of 1973, at which time he was appointed to the faculty of Assuit University, where he was awarded a post as professor of theology. In 1977, still under police surveillance, he decided to go into exile in Saudi Arabia, where he spent 3 years teaching there and became more deeply immersed in a militant, hardline form of Islam. Between 1977 and 1980, private Muslim foundations in Saudi Arabia financed a tour of teaching for Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman in the kingdom. Upon being expelled back to Egypt, he became notorious for his militant sermons and occasional fatwas, often recorded on audio tape cassettes. They were peddled openly on sidewalks in front of major mosques. During periods when the government forbade this, they were clandestinely passed from hand to hand and from one mosque congregation to another. During the 1970s, Abdel Rahman developed close ties with Egyptian Islamic Jihad and helped launch Al-Gamma Islamiyah, otherwise known as the Islamic Group, where he was eventually seen as their spiritual leader. Although still revered by followers of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which by the 1980s was being led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abdel Rahman's goal with Al-Gamma Islamiyah was to overthrow the Sadat regime and establish a theocratic Islamic State. This group carried out terrorist attacks in Egypt before he returned from exile in Saudi Arabia in 1980. He was arrested a month before the assassination of President Anwar Sadat in October of 1981 because members of his Islamic group had participated in the assassination. Abdel Rahman was tried for conspiracy to overthrow the Egyptian government, but because the evidence was circumstantial, he was acquitted. He was released from prison in 1984, and then promptly sued the state for torturing him in prison, a suit eventually settled for $10,000. Despite his acquittal, the Egyptian government kept him under house arrest for the next 6 years. In 1985, allowing him to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. From 1985 to 1990, Abdel Rahman traveled widely throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, and the United States in 1987, speaking to Muslim audiences. But only in the late 1980s in Peshawar, Pakistan, Abdel Rahman became involved with the U.S. and Pakistani intelligence officials at the end of their orchestrated Afghan war against the Soviets. In 1989, Abdel Rahman is arrested in Egypt and held under very closely guarded house arrest, but he manages to escape to Sudan 1 year later, possibly being smuggled out of the house in a washing machine. The blind sheikh first enters the United States on May 10, 1990, just months before U.S. buildup against Iraq during Operation Desert Shield. He obtains his first U.S. visa via the CIA. A State Department official will later discover this was the first of 6 U.S. visas given to him between 1986 and 1990.
Despite his extreme views, the Sheikh is acquitted and released from prison. In 1990, he flees to Sudan, where the American consulate misses his name on a watch list and mistakenly issues a visa. The blind Sheikh arrives in the United States. He settles into the Muslim community around the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn